She said it in the middle of dinner, not loudly, not carelessly, with the specific, calibrated casualness of a person who has said a thing in front of someone they believe cannot understand it many times before, and who has grown comfortable with the invisibility that assumption provides. The way you talk in front of a sleeping dog. The way you speak freely in a room you believe to be empty. The restaurant was called Osteria della Volta in the Prati neighborhood of Rome, 12 minutes by taxi from the hotel where we were staying for what my wife had described when she suggested the trip in March as a second honeymoon. We had been married for 22 years. The original honeymoon had been in Greece, a week in Santorini when we were both young enough to believe that a honeymoon was a destination and not yet wise enough to understand that it is actually a beginning, and that beginnings require more care than the planning of them usually receives. This one, Catherine said, should be Italy, Rome specifically. She had always wanted to see Rome properly, she said, not in transit, not for a conference, but actually with time and attention. And 22 years deserved to be marked with something beautiful. I had agreed. I had been agreeing with my wife for 22 years, in the way of a man who loves his wife and who finds over time that agreement is the easier path through most of the ordinary disagreements that a long marriage produces, and who has accepted this as part of the arithmetic of commitment, without always asking himself whether the arithmetic was correct. I had not agreed to this particular dinner, which had been arranged without my knowledge, to include a man named Stefano Carucci, who was my wife's colleague from the International Development Organization where she worked, and who had, as I understood it, from the way Catherine had described him over the previous several months, been based in Rome for the past 2 years. My wife had mentioned Stefano in passing several times over those months, his name appearing in the account of a conference call here, a project update there, an anecdote about something that had happened in the Rome office that required his specific involvement, the specific frequency of a name that is becoming more present in a person's daily life without the person necessarily being aware of how present it has become, or without the other person in the marriage being able to say with precision when the frequency crossed from ordinary to notable. We had been at the table for 40 minutes when my wife turned to Stefano and said, in Italian, with a small laugh that had a quality I recognized from 22 years of knowing her laugh, not the full laugh, not the one that belongs to genuine amusement, but the lighter, more social one that belongs to a moment of shared understanding between two people who have established a specific private register. Non capisce l'italiano. È troppo semplice per accorgersene. He doesn't understand Italian. He's too simple to notice. I set down my fork, not dramatically, not in the way of a man making a point for the room, in the ordinary way of a man who has finished the bite he was chewing and is setting down his fork because his hands are empty and his mind is very, very full, and because the hands need to be somewhere while the mind does what it needs to do. I looked at Stefano Carucci, who was 38 years old and who had the specific confidence of a man who has been told, directly or indirectly, that the husband across the table from him is not a concern, not a threat, not a person who's paying close attention to the texture of a conversation conducted in a language that has been assumed to be inaccessible. I said, in Italian, Capisco, abbastanza. I understand enough. The expression on Stefano's face in the half-second after I said those two words is the kind of expression you see on a person when the floor of a room they believe to be solid has revealed itself suddenly and without warning to be something else entirely. Not the dramatic collapse, the more interesting thing, which is the rapid, involuntary recalculation. The expression of a man who is in real time running backward through the evening's conversation and assessing what he said and when he said it, and what it means that the person he believed was not in the room was, in fact, in the room the entire time. My wife's expression was different. Hers I will describe later, because it requires more space than I have here at the beginning of this story, and because the beginning of this story is not actually that dinner table in Rome. The beginning is 34 years earlier, in a small town in Umbria, in the summer of 1989, when I was 23 years old and working as an apprentice to a stonemason named Franco Benedetti, and the Italian I was learning was not something I was studying in a classroom, but something I was living, which is the only way to learn a language that stays with you for the rest of your life. Let me start there. My name is Robert Mele. I am 57 years old. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the son of an Italian-American father whose family came from Calabria in 1923, and who grew up in the specific Italian-American household of that era. The Sunday gravy simmering from 8 in the morning, the grandmother who spoke only the Calabrian dialect and who treated standard Italian as a kind of formal dress she put on for strangers, the particular cultural texture of a community that was Italian in its bones and American in its daily life, and that maintained an uneasy, affectionate, occasionally confusing relationship with both identities simultaneously. My father's generation was the generation that could have gone either way, could have kept the language or let it go, could have maintained the connection or allowed it to dissolve into the general American project of becoming simply American. My father kept it, not fluently, not without the specific gaps and hesitations of a person who speaks a language primarily at home and in memory rather than in the world, but he kept it, and the keeping of it was one of the things that distinguished him, in my understanding of him, from the men around him who had made the other choice. He taught me some of it when I was young, the way parents teach children things they consider worth knowing. The greetings, the table words, the phrases that belong to the kitchen and the family gathering and the particular occasions of a life organized around people who shared a history. By the time I was 16, I had a foundation, not a building. A foundation, the kind that tells you the soil is right and the work is possible, but that cannot yet be lived in. In 1989, I graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with a degree in architecture. I had spent 5 years learning to see space, to think about the relationship between materials and light and human use, to understand what it meant to design something that would exist in the world and would be used by people who had not been part of the designing. I had also spent 5 years developing a specific interest in traditional construction methods, the way buildings had been made before the industrialization of construction, the knowledge that lived in the hands of craftsmen and in the specific vocabulary of their trades, the kind of material intelligence that could not be fully captured in drawings and specifications, but had to be transmitted through the body, through doing. I had won a small travel fellowship, modest in amount, enough for a summer in Europe if you were careful and willing to work, not enough for the kind of travel that treats a place as scenery rather than as something to be inside. I had intended to spend it in Paris. Paris was where architecture students went in 1989 when they won travel fellowships. Paris was the correct answer to the question of where a young American architect should spend a significant summer, because Paris had Haussmann and Le Corbusier, and the specific beauty of a city that had been consciously designed rather than accumulated, and because Paris had a mythology that architecture schools had been cultivating for a century. I went to Italy instead, not because of a grand decision or a dramatic change of plan, because of a conversation in May at a student exhibition in the architecture building at Carnegie Mellon with a professor named Carmela Russo, who had grown up in Naples and who'd been teaching at the school for 11 years, and who had, over the course of my final year, been the single most demanding and most useful critic of my work. She looked at my drawings for a project I had been developing about traditional stone construction methods, the specific details of dry stone walling and mortared rubble construction that I had been researching through historical sources. And she said, in the way she said everything, which was directly and without the softening that professors sometimes apply to comments that need to land hard. You have the thinking. You don't have the material. You are drawing stone the way a person draws something they have read about, not the way a person draws something they have touched. Go to Italy. Find someone who builds in stone and work with your hands until you understand what the thinking is supposed to serve. The thinking without the material is just theory, and theory without material is useless to the people who are going to live inside what you build. I went to Italy. I found Franco Benedetti through a chain of connections that began with Professor Russo's address book. She had contacts in every region of the country, cultivated over a professional life that had moved between Italy and the United States and back several times. And that ended with a telephone call made from a payphone in Perugia on a Tuesday afternoon in June to a number written on a piece of paper in Professor Russo's handwriting. A call during which I explained in my limited but earnest Italian that I was an American architecture student who wanted to learn stone construction from someone who actually practiced it, that I was willing to work as hard as required to be paid whatever was fair, and to stay for as long as I was useful. Franco said in Italian, with the specific brevity of a man who has assessed a situation and reached his conclusion and sees no reason to discuss it further. Quando arrivi? When do you arrive? I arrived the next day. Franco Benedetti was 51 years old in the summer of 1989, which means he was born in 1938 and had grown up in Umbria during the German occupation and the years immediately following the war, in the specific material conditions of a rural Italian family in that period, which shaped him in ways that were visible in everything he did. The way he used materials without waste, the way he assessed a wall before touching it, the way he understood the difference between what something appeared to be and what it actually was, structurally, at the level where things either held or did not hold. He was not a tall man. He was the kind of man whose physical presence was entirely a function of his hands and his posture. Hands that had been working stone for 30 years and that showed it in every dimension, thickened at the joints, scarred in specific places that corresponded to specific tools, capable of feeling things about a piece of stone that I would not have been able to feel for years. His posture was the posture of a man who has spent decades in close physical relationship with heavy permanent materials, and who has the specific uprightness of a body that knows what it is for. He paid me a modest daily wage, enough for the room I rented in the village and for my meals. He fed me dinner 3 nights a week at the table of his house, where his wife Juliana cooked with the same understanding of permanence and proportion that Franco brought to stone. Everything from scratch, everything timed correctly, everything served at the temperature at which it was meant to be served, in the specific sequence that Umbrian cooking requires, which is a sequence that reflects an understanding of the body's relationship to food that goes back further than any of the recipes themselves. I ate at that table and listened to the conversation between Franco and Juliana and their 2 daughters, who were 15 and 18 that summer. And I absorbed the language in the way that you absorb a language when you are surrounded by it and when your survival, social, professional, basic daily function depends on understanding it. Franco spoke to me entirely in Italian, not because he lacked other options. He had a limited English from a period in the 1970s when he had done some work for a British restoration firm, but because he had decided, without stating it and without any discussion, that the correct way for a person to learn a language is to be inside it without rescue, and that the discomfort of not understanding is the primary motor of the understanding that follows, and that a person who can retreat to their own language whenever the going gets hard will never reach the point where the going stops being hard, because that point is only reachable from the other side of the discomfort, not around it. He was right. He was right about most things. By the end of the first month, I understood most of what Franco said in the course of the work, because Franco talked about what we were doing while we were doing it. The name of each tool delivered at the moment of its use. The name of each technique explained at the moment of its application. The specific vocabulary of Umbrian stone construction that had been developed over centuries and that existed, as all craft vocabulary exists, at the precise intersection of the physical and the linguistic, in a way that made them inseparable. You could not learn the word without doing the thing, and doing the thing without the word was formless and unanchored, and so the language and the work arrived together and reinforced each other in a way that is completely different from the way language is acquired in a classroom, where the word and the thing are separated by the medium of instruction, and where the physical is always at some level metaphorical. By the end of the second month, I was having real conversations at dinner, not long ones, not sophisticated ones, but real in the sense of being exchanges between 2 people who are genuinely communicating rather than performing the form of communication. Franco asked me one evening about my grandfather, and I told him what I knew, which was not much but was enough for a conversation, and he told me about his own grandfather, who had built walls in this same valley before the First War. And we sat at the table after Juliana had cleared the dishes, and we talked about the specific relationship between stone and place, about how the walls of a region reflect the geology of the ground beneath them, about how a craftsman who has worked stone in one place cannot simply transfer his knowledge to another place without a period of learning that is as much about the stone as about the technique. I stayed for 3 months. I came back to Pittsburgh in September and started my career in architecture, first at a firm, then eventually as a founding partner of the practice I have been with for 18 years. And I maintained my Italian through the specific stubbornness of a person who has earned something at real cost and does not intend to allow the earning to have been for nothing. I took an advanced language course in my first year back. I joined a conversation group at the Italian Cultural Institute in Pittsburgh, which met on Thursday evenings and which I attended for 4 years. I subscribed to an Italian newspaper, La Repubblica, and read it every morning for 15 years, not because I needed the news from Italy specifically, but because reading a newspaper is the most efficient way to maintain a language at the level of daily contemporary use. I read Italian novels, not translated, the actual novels in the actual language, with a dictionary in the early years and with less and less need for it as the years accumulated. By my mid-30s, my Italian was the Italian of a person who has been using it continuously for 15 years, which is to say, fluent, with an American accent that native speakers identify within a few sentences, but with a vocabulary and a grammatical confidence that tells those same speakers equally quickly that this is not a tourist and not a student, but a person who has been living inside the language for long enough to have made it genuinely his. I have been an architect for 31 years. I have been a partner in my firm for 18. The work we do is primarily institutional and cultural. Public libraries, university buildings, performing arts spaces, the category of architecture that is required to be both functional and permanent, which is the combination I have always found most interesting and most genuinely difficult, because functional and permanent do not automatically align, and making them align requires exactly the kind of material intelligence that Franco Benedetti spent one summer transmitting to me through stone and mortar and the specific, uncompromising attention of a craftsman who understood that the work is either right or it is not, and that the difference between right and not right is visible to anyone who looks carefully enough, regardless of whether they have the vocabulary for what they are seeing. Several of our firm's projects have involved stone or materials that reference stone, and in every one of those projects, what I know about what I am doing has roots that go back to that summer. This is not something I say for effect. It is the simple truth of how knowledge works when it enters through the body, rather than through the page. I have also, in the 22 years of my marriage, never told my wife that I speak Italian. I want to explain this because it is the part of the story that requires the most honest accounting, and honest accounting is what I owe both you and myself. The first answer to why I never told Catherine is the simple one, the one that is true and also not the whole truth. It never came up in a way that required me to declare it. Catherine does not speak Italian. We did not travel to Italy until 2008, 7 years into the marriage, and that trip was to Milan for a design conference that I attended professionally. A 4-day trip with packed schedules and professional dinners and the specific conditions of a work trip that do not encourage the kind of extended personal conversation in which a person might naturally reveal that they have been speaking Italian fluently for 20 years. In the years between our marriage in 2001 and that trip in 2008, Italian had not been a visible part of my daily life as Catherine experienced it. I spoke it to myself occasionally when I was alone and thinking through a problem. Italian is, for me, a language associated with material and craft and the specific concentration of close physical work, and it sometimes surfaces when I am working through a design problem that has a material dimension. I spoke it on phone calls with my cousin Giuseppina in Reggio Calabria, who is 83 years old and who does not speak English, and who had been, since the death of my father in 2005, the last living member of that generation of my family. These calls happened when Catherine was traveling for work, which was frequently, and they were not long, 20 minutes, half an hour, the specific conversations of two people who love each other and who have limited common territory for that love to express itself across, which is its own kind of tenderness. Catherine did not know about Giuseppina. I want to sit with that fact for a moment because it is significant, and I want to give it its due significance. My cousin, my father's cousin actually, a woman who had known my father as a young man and who had attended his funeral and who sent a card every Christmas written in the Calabrian dialect that I had to work to read, was a person entirely absent from Catherine's knowledge of my life. Not because I had hidden her, because the conversation that would have introduced her had never happened, in the specific way that conversations in a long marriage can fail to happen not through malice or deception, but through the accumulated assumption that the things not yet mentioned are not particularly important. This is the first answer. It never came up. The second answer is more complicated and is the one I have spent the most time with since Rome. At some point in the middle years of the marriage, I cannot identify the exact year, because the thing I am describing did not announce itself, but developed gradually, the way water damage develops in a wall, invisible for a long time, and then suddenly obvious. I noticed that Catherine had a tendency to characterize me to other people in terms that were reductive, not cruel, not, in most cases, inaccurate in the limited sense of the thing being said, reductive in the larger sense, the sense in which a complex, variable, continuing person is compressed into a stable, simple type. He's very practical. He doesn't really get the political dimensions of these things. He's more comfortable with the concrete stuff, less with the abstract. He's not really a traveler at heart. He wouldn't enjoy that kind of event. He's a homebody. He's not much of a reader. He's not particularly interested in whatever the particular territory was that the characterization was designed to exclude me from. I heard these characterizations at dinner parties, at professional events, at family gatherings, where Catherine would explain me to the people around her in the specific shorthand of long married people who have developed a stable description of their spouse and who deploy it reflexively, without necessarily intending harm, because the description is efficient and because the person being described is present and therefore available to correct any significant errors. I did not correct significant errors. I want to examine this honestly, because the failure to correct is my failure, and it needs to be named as such. I did not correct because I had developed over the middle years of the marriage a specific avoidance of direct confrontation with Catherine about the way she characterized me, because direct confrontation on this specific subject produced a very consistent result. Catherine, who was trained in the dynamics of institutional power and interpersonal conflict, and who was professionally expert at naming the relational dimensions of an interaction before engaging with the content, would respond by framing my objection as a form of insecurity, and the conversation would become about my insecurity rather than about her characterization, and I would retreat from the conversation with the specific exhaustion of a person who has tried to say something true and has ended up in a conversation about themselves rather than about the thing. So I stopped trying to correct the characterizations. And in stopping, I contributed to their continuation and their deepening. He's too simple to notice. That sentence was not the first version of that characterization. It was the purest version, the version that existed when there was no audience to perform for, when the only witness was a person she believed could not understand. The English versions, the ones I had been hearing for years, were modulated for an audience that included me. The Italian version was what she actually thought, stripped of the social consideration that the English version still retained. I had kept the Italian secret for 22 years. I had kept it first by accident, then by the inertia of the accident, and then, I have to be honest about this, by a choice that I made somewhere in the middle years without fully articulating the choice to myself. I kept it because the Italian was something that was entirely mine, not shared, not subject to characterization, not available to be compressed into a type. The summer with Franco, the language, the understanding of stone and material, and the specific intelligence that comes from working with your hands in close relationship with permanent things. These were parts of me that Catherine did not have access to, and in a marriage where access to the rest of me had been over time replaced by the simplified category. I had held on to the Italian the way you hold on to the thing that reminds you of who you actually are. I am not presenting this as wisdom. It was not wisdom. It was a person maintaining a private space because the alternative, fighting for the full version of himself to be seen, had become too exhausting to sustain. That is not wisdom. That is a form of surrender dressed as protection. But it was also, as it turned out, the specific form of surrender that produced exactly the right evidence at exactly the right moment. Let me tell you about Stefano Carucci with the fairness that honesty requires. He was 38 years old at the time of the dinner, a man who had grown up in Rome, studied at La Sapienza, done graduate work in Geneva, and spent the previous decade in a career in international development that had moved him between Rome, Geneva, Nairobi, and Dhaka, in a rhythm of field postings and headquarters assignments that is the specific professional itinerary of a certain kind of ambitious, internationally minded person in that field. He was intelligent. I could see this clearly across the table in the way he engaged with ideas, the specific quality of his listening, the connections he made. He was also undeniably attractive in the way that a certain kind of confident, well-traveled, intellectually assured man in his late 30s is attractive to a certain kind of woman, not because of any single feature, but because of the totality of a presentation that communicates, I am a person who goes places and does things and finds meaning in the doing. He was sitting across from my wife at a restaurant in Rome, and my wife was laughing at the right moments and leaning slightly forward in a way I recognized from the early years of our own relationship. And the Italian she had used to describe me to him was not the Italian of a colleague describing a colleague's spouse. It was the Italian of a person sharing an intimate's private shorthand with another intimate. I had suspected this. The months leading up to Rome had contained the specific accumulation of evidence that is not quite evidence. The increased frequency of Stefano's name, the Rome trips that were slightly less detailed in Catherine's account than her usual professional travel, the quality of her attention when her phone notified her of a message during the evenings, the way she sometimes paused in conversation as if something she was saying reminded her of a conversation she had been having elsewhere. I had not confronted her. I have explained why. The pattern of confrontation in this marriage did not produce access to truth. It produced conversations about the confrontation. But I had called Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt has been my lawyer for 16 years. He handles the firm's legal matters and my personal legal matters, and he is the kind of lawyer who, when you call him and say you want to understand your options without having made a decision yet, understands immediately that this is a different kind of call from the ordinary professional calls and gives it the appropriate kind of attention. I had called Dale in February, 2 months before Rome, and I had laid out what I knew and what I suspected and what I did not yet know, and Dale had said, in the way that good lawyers say things that you need to hear, "Robert, come and see me when you're back from Italy." I had made the appointment. It was sitting in my calendar for the Wednesday after we returned. "Capisco, abbastanza." I said it quietly, without drama, without the additional emphasis that would have turned 2 words into a performance. The words were sufficient. The words had been waiting for 34 years for exactly this moment, though I had not known in any of those 34 years that the moment was coming. Stefano went still in the way that I described earlier, the rapid, involuntary recalculation. I watched his eyes move, briefly, to Catherine, and I watched him understand something from her expression that told him the situation was exactly what my 2 words had implied. Then he looked back at me with the expression of a man who is deciding in real time how to conduct himself in circumstances that have changed significantly from the circumstances in which he began the evening. He was, as I said, intelligent. He did not attempt to brazen it out. He did not pretend the Italian had not been said. He sat with the information for a moment, and then he said carefully, in Italian, "Mi scusi, è stato irrispettoso." Excuse me, that was disrespectful. I said in Italian, "Sì, lo era." Yes, it was. Then I said in English, because what I had to say next was for Catherine and I wanted it in a language that left no room for ambiguity. And so is a great deal of other things that have been said, in various languages, in various rooms, over a period of time that I am no longer willing to leave unaddressed. Catherine said, "Robert." I said, "Not here, not at this table." She looked at Stefano. He looked at her. The specific exchange of a look between 2 people who have a private language and who are suddenly aware that the privacy of it has been, and perhaps has always been, less absolute than they believed. I picked up my fork. I want to explain the decision to continue eating, because it is the decision that I am most often asked about when I tell this story, and the explanation matters. I continued eating because I had ordered the cacio e pepe, which was prepared well, and because I am 57 years old and I have learned in 57 years of living and 31 years of professional practice that the decisions made in the heated, immediate aftermath of a significant revelation are almost always the wrong decisions. The heat distorts the assessment. The correct decisions are the ones made after the assessment has been conducted with the full information and with the specific calm that comes from having allowed the heat to dissipate before acting. Franco Benedetti had a saying, "Un lavoro iniziato si completa." A begun work is completed. He said it about stone, about mortar, about every task that required seeing through from beginning to end, and I had been applying it, imperfectly but consistently, to other things for 34 years. The dinner was a begun work. I intended to complete it. Stefano left at 10:30. He made his farewells with the careful correctness of a man who has understood that the evening has gone somewhere he did not anticipate and who is extracting himself with what dignity remains available. His handshake was not something I will describe in detail. It said what such handshakes say. Catherine and I walked back to the hotel through the Rome evening. The city was doing what Rome does on a warm June night, entirely, unapologetically itself. The fountains, the scooters, the specific quality of the street lighting on the old stone that I know how to read because I spent a summer learning to read it. I looked at the city without needing it to be anything other than what it was. We sat in the hotel room and she talked for a long time. I am going to give you the substance of what she said rather than the exact words, partly because the exact words are hers and belong to her, and partly because what matters is not the specific sentence, but the structure of the account, which reveals something about how a very intelligent person can maintain two parallel accounts of their own life for an extended period and what the conditions are that allow that maintenance to continue. She had known Stefano for 3 years. The relationship had become personal 14 months prior in Rome during a 10-day project review. She had been telling herself, in the month since, a sequence of things that any honest accounting of the situation would reveal as the things a person tells themselves when they are not yet willing to fully confront what they are doing. That it was not serious, that it was the product of the specific loneliness of extended professional travel, a loneliness that she felt genuinely and that I want to be honest about as a real condition rather than an excuse, that it did not constitute a threat to the marriage because she had not decided it constituted a threat. She was not, in saying these things, lying to me. She was reporting accurately the things she had been telling herself. Whether those things were true was a different question. She had not planned for the dinner to happen as it did. She had arranged for Stefano to join us because she had wanted, on some level, that she could not fully explain even now, for the two parts of her life to be in the same room, to see what that was like, to understand something about it by experiencing it, rather than by thinking about it. This is the specific logic of a person who is more intelligent than they are self-aware, which is a particular kind of intelligence failure that is more common among very capable people than it ought to be. She had genuinely believed I did not speak Italian. I said, "What led you to that conclusion?" She said, "You never spoke it. In 22 years you never—" I said, "I spoke it to my cousin in Calabria." She said, "I didn't know about your cousin." I said, "Giuseppina. She is 83. She does not speak English. We talk 4 or 5 times a year. She knew my father when he was a young man." Catherine looked at me with the expression of a person who has just encountered a fact that her model of a person does not contain, and who is, in real time, understanding what that means. Not just the Italian, not just Giuseppina, but the larger implication, which is that the model is wrong in ways that extend beyond any single fact. I said, "What else have you assumed?" She said, "Robert," I said, "I'm asking seriously. The Italian is a specific case of a general assumption. You have assumed that the version of me you formulated, fairly early in this marriage, is the complete version, that you understood me quickly and fully, and that the understanding has not required ongoing revision. I want to know what else falls inside that assumption." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I think I stopped being curious about you. Somewhere in the middle years, I stopped treating you as someone I was still discovering and started treating you as someone I had already discovered, and the version I had discovered was smaller than you are. I can see that now. I could not see it before tonight." I said, "I know." She said, "The thing I said, he's too simple to notice. Robert, I said, I need you to understand that that sentence is not new. It is the Italian version of things you have been saying in English in rooms I was present in for years. The difference is that the Italian version is the honest version, the one you say when you believe you are unobserved. The English versions are performed for an audience. Tonight I heard the version that is not performed." She said, "I know." I said, "And the Italian version is worse. Not because the words are worse. He's too simple to notice is the same statement in any language. It's worse because of the freedom with which you said it. You said it the way you say something you believe completely and have been believing for a long time. Not with any discomfort, with a laugh." She did not say anything. I said, "That laugh. I know that laugh. I have known that laugh for 22 years. It is the laugh that means you and another person share something, and that the sharing excludes someone else, and that the exclusion is comfortable. I have heard that laugh directed at other people. Tonight I heard it directed at me, and the specific comfort of it, the ease of it, that is the part that is going to take me the longest to sit with." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." I said, "I'm not going to make any decisions tonight. I'm going to tell you 2 things, and then I'm going to sleep. And tomorrow we're going to fly home. And when we're home, I'm going to do what I need to do." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I have an appointment with Dale Pruitt on Wednesday. He has been expecting me." She was very still. I said, "That doesn't mean the appointment will produce what you're afraid it will produce. I don't know what it will produce. What I know is that I have been carrying information and waiting for the right moment to do something with it. And the right moment has arrived. And now I'm going to do something with it. The something is not predetermined." She said, "What are the 2 things?" I said, "The first is that the Stefano situation and the too simple to notice situation are 2 different matters, and I need you to hold them separately. The Stefano situation is about a decision you made about this marriage. The too simple to notice situation is about how you have been seeing me and speaking about me for a long time, longer than Stefano, longer than anything that happened in the past 14 months. Those are different problems with different roots and different implications, and I'm not willing to have them collapsed into one thing." She said, "Okay." I said, "The second thing is that in 34 years of speaking Italian, the most useful thing I ever learned to say was Capisco abbastanza. Not because it's grammatically interesting, because it is exactly true and it is never the thing the other person expects. Tonight, it was 2 words. In the months ahead, it is going to require a great many more, but I intend to say all of them in whatever language the situation requires, for as long as it takes to have the full conversation instead of the managed one." She said, "Okay?" I said, "Okay." I slept. I walked to the Pantheon the next morning at 6. I have wanted to see the Pantheon since I was a student at Carnegie Mellon, when Professor Russo assigned Panofsky's essay on the history of the building, and I understood, reading it, that some structures are not primarily about utility or even about beauty, but about something older than either, about the human need to make a permanent mark on time, to build something that will exist after the building is no longer possible, that will carry forward the moment of its making into futures that cannot be anticipated. The Pantheon was built in its current form by the Emperor Hadrian between 118 and 128 A.D. It has been in continuous use since then. 1,900 years of use, of human life conducted inside and around it, of weddings and funerals and quiet visits and loud tourists and the specific dailiness of a neighborhood that has organized itself around a building for nearly 2 millennia. It is the oldest continuously used building in the world, which is a distinction that means something specific to a structural engineer and architect. It means the building was built correctly, not approximately correctly, correctly. The dome, the proportions, the relationship between mass and void, the oculus that is simultaneously the building's primary light source and its most radical gesture. All of it has held for 1,900 years, and the holding is the proof of the correctness. I stood under the oculus at 6:15 in the morning in a building that was almost empty at that hour, with the circle of morning sky visible above me and the specific silence of a space that is large enough to absorb sound and old enough to have absorbed centuries of it. The light came through the oculus in the particular way of a light source that is overhead and open, falling in a column that moved slowly across the floor as the earth turned, and I stood in it, and I thought about what I was going to do. I thought about Franco Benedetti. I thought about a Tuesday morning in August 1989 when he had set me to pointing a section of wall that had been poorly done by a previous craftsman, a wall that was structurally sound, but that had been finished without care, with mortar that was the wrong mix, and joints that were the wrong depth, and a surface that looked at a distance adequate, and that revealed its inadequacy only on close inspection. Franco had said, "Non abbastanza vicino," not close enough. And he had shown me how to look at the wall from 2 inches rather than from 2 feet. And from 2 inches, the inadequacy was unmistakable, and the correct approach was obvious. I had been looking at my marriage from 2 feet for a long time. The Italian had moved me to 2 inches. From 2 inches, the structure was clear. I thought about what Catherine had said. I stopped being curious about you. I stopped treating you as someone I was still discovering. I had done the same thing in a different way. I had stopped insisting on being fully known. I had allowed the simplified version to stand because challenging it was costly, and because I had found in the Italian and in the private space it represented a sufficient alternative to the full knowing. We had both, in our different ways, stopped doing the work that a long marriage requires to remain a living thing rather than a settled arrangement. This was not a comfortable understanding. It was the correct one. I walked back to the hotel at 8. Catherine was up. She had made coffee from the room machine, and she handed me a cup without speaking, and I took it, and we stood at the window together and looked at the section of Rome that the window showed us. The rooftop of the building across the street, a dome in the middle distance, the June sky going from the pale blue of early morning to the stronger blue of a day that was going to be clear and warm. She said, "Tell me about Franco Benedetti. I looked at her. She said, "You mentioned him at the table. I want to know who he is. I want to know about the summer. I want to know what you were doing before I knew you and what it made you into. I want to start from the beginning." I said, "We have a flight at 4. She said, "That's 8 hours. I said, "It's a long story?" She said, "I know. I'm asking for the long version." I thought about Franco. Un lavoro iniziato si completa. A begun work is completed. The work of being known, the full work, the real work, the work that requires both people to be present and curious and willing to revise their understanding continuously, had been interrupted in the middle years. It could be resumed. Whether it would be resumed and what it would look like if it was were questions that would require more than 8 hours to answer. But 8 hours was where it started. I said, "I went to Italy in the summer of 1989. She said, "Tell me." I told her. I met with Dale Pruitt on the Wednesday after we returned. He listened to the full account. He asked the questions that lawyers ask when they are making sure the picture is complete, not leading questions, not questions that imply a direction, but the questions of a person who needs to understand a situation before advising on it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Robert, what do you want?" I said, "I want to know my options." He walked me through them. He was thorough and clear and did not editorialize, which is one of the reasons I have trusted him for 16 years. By the end of the meeting, I had a complete picture of what the options were and what each of them would require and what each of them would produce. I did not make a decision in Dale's office. I made it 3 weeks later, sitting in my home office in Pittsburgh, in the house that Catherine and I had lived in for 18 years, looking at the drawings pinned to the wall of a library project we were building in Allegheny County. A limestone-clad building with a reading room that received its light from a clear story on the north face, a building that would, if we had done our work correctly, be standing in 100 years and would still be doing what it was designed to do. The decision was to stay. I want to explain this decision the way I would explain a design decision, which is by reference to the site conditions and the program requirements and the long-term ambition of the project. The site was a 22-year marriage that had developed in its middle period significant deficiencies, a pattern of characterization that had diminished one party, a parallel emotional life that had divided the other, a failure of curiosity on both sides that had allowed the simplified version of each person to substitute for the actual person. These were real deficiencies, and they required real remediation. The program was a relationship between two specific people who had chosen each other in 2001 and who had, in the best periods of those 22 years, been genuinely good for each other, intellectually, practically, in the specific daily ways that constitute the texture of a shared life. The program had not failed. The execution had drifted from the program in ways that required correction. The long-term ambition was to build something that held, not something adequate, something correct, from the inside where it counts, not from the distance where everything looks adequate. I told Catherine the decision that evening. I told her the conditions under which it was made, which were that Stefano was over definitively and immediately, and that this was not a negotiation, that we were going to spend the following year in the kind of conversation we had not been having, with a couples therapist who came recommended by Dale's wife, who had been practicing for 25 years and who was known for her specific capacity to tolerate the difficult conversations that most couples avoid. That I was going to stop managing my own presence in this marriage and start insisting on the full version of myself being present, which would require her to revise her model and me to stop making the revision easy to avoid. Catherine said, "Yes." She did not say it quickly. She said it the way you say yes to a difficult thing, when you have understood the full weight of what you are agreeing to and have decided that the weight is appropriate to the importance of the thing. Stefano Carucci is no longer in Catherine's professional life. She made this decision herself before I asked for it, which mattered, that it was hers, made from her own assessment of what was necessary rather than from a requirement I had imposed. She told me she had made it the week after we returned, in a meeting she arranged in the Rome office by video call, professional and final, in the specific way of a person who understands that some endings need to be clean. We have been in weekly sessions with the therapist for 8 months. The therapist's name is Dr. Sandra Malik, and she is, as advertised, a person who tolerates the difficult conversation without flinching from it and without letting it run past the point where it is still productive. I have said things in those sessions that I had not said in 22 years of marriage, in Italian or in English or in any other language. Catherine has said things equally. The conversations have been, on several occasions, genuinely difficult, in the way that only true things said in the presence of another person can be difficult. The first session, I will tell you, was the hardest. Not because of the content. The content was not yet available in the first session, which is mostly about establishing the conditions under which the content can be said. It was hard because sitting in a room with a professional whose specific purpose is to facilitate a conversation you have been not having for years requires you to acknowledge, simply by being there, that the not having has been a choice, that you chose the managed version over the real one for long enough that the managed version became the default, and that undoing a default requires more sustained, deliberate effort than establishing it did. Dr. Malik said something in the second session that I have thought about many times since. She said, "The thing that most often destroys a long marriage is not a single large event. It is the accumulation of small abdications, moments when the true thing goes unsaid because the cost of saying it seems, in that moment, higher than the cost of silence. The problem is that the cost of silence is not paid immediately. It is deferred, and deferred costs accumulate interest." I thought about Franco when she'd said that. About the wall I had been set to point in August 1989, the one that was adequate at 2 feet and inadequate at 2 inches. The inadequacy had not announced itself loudly. It had simply been there, waiting to be seen by anyone who looked closely enough. They have also been, despite the difficulty, the most alive conversations we have had in years, which tells you something about what we had allowed to happen in the middle period and what it is possible to recover when you decide that recovering it is the priority. There is something I want to say about the middle years of this marriage that I have not yet said, because it requires an honesty that is uncomfortable and that I owe both you and myself. I was not simply a victim of Catherine's characterization. I was a participant in it. Not because I agreed with it. I did not agree with it, and the discomfort of hearing it was real every time I heard it. But because I chose, repeatedly and over many years, to allow it to stand uncorrected rather than pay the cost of the correction, and in allowing it to stand, I contributed to the architecture of a marriage in which one person's version of the other had calcified into something that neither party was any longer examining. That is not Catherine's failure alone. It is a shared failure that required both of us to participate. The Italian was my private resistance to that calcification, but private resistance held in silence does not produce change. It produces the specific static condition of a person who knows they are being misread and who maintains a secret proof of the misreading without ever presenting the proof. That is not a solution. That is a postponement, and postponements accumulate their own costs, as Dr. Malik would say, their own interest that comes due eventually. In a restaurant in Rome, in front of a man named Stefano Carucci, at a price that nobody had planned for. I called Giuseppina in Calabria last month. She is 83, and her memory is variable now. She knew my name immediately, but it took her a moment to place the call to locate me in the geography of her long memory. When she did, she said, "Roberto, come stai finalmente?" Roberto, how are you finally? Finally, as if she had been waiting for the call. I said, "Ho molto da raccontare, zia?" I have a lot to tell you, aunt. She said, "Allora comincia dall'inizio." Then begin at the beginning. Franco Benedetti died in 2014. I learned this several years after the fact from a person who had worked with him in the later years, and who told me that Franco had been building walls up until the last year, which surprised no one who had known him, and which I found when I heard it exactly right. He had worked stone for 50 years. He had transmitted what he knew to the people who came to learn from him, not because he was a teacher in any formal sense, but because the work required transmission, and he understood this and made himself available for it. I intend to go back to Umbria. I have been intending to go back since 2014, and I have not gone. This year, I will go. I want to see the walls he built, the ones that are still standing, that will stand for another 100 years if the maintenance is done correctly. I want to put my hand on the stone and feel what he taught me to feel, and I want to understand from the inside of that feeling what 34 years of carrying something has produced. The Italian is not a secret anymore. Catherine speaks some now. She has been taking lessons since January with a teacher in Pittsburgh who comes on Tuesday mornings, and her Italian is currently at the level of a person who is working hard and who has enough of a foundation to be making real progress. She calls it her accountability. I call it the right use of a Tuesday morning. The Pantheon is still standing. It will be standing long after this story has dissolved into whatever it dissolves into. The oculus is still open to the sky, and the light still falls through it in a column that moves slowly across the floor as the earth turns, and the building is still doing, 1900 years later, exactly what it was designed to do. That is what it means to build something correctly. Capisco, abbastanza. I understand enough. As it turned out, enough was more than anyone expected, and enough in the right moment, spoken clearly, without drama, with 34 years of earned knowledge behind it, is sufficient. See you in the next one.